The two most influential books on evolutionary theory are Robert Chambers' Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, 1844, and Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, 1976. I'm going to start with Chambers. Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation by Robert Chambers, 1844. Britain seemed to need a lifetime to overcome its revulsion at the materialism and atheism it saw as responsible for the horrors of the French Revolution. Darwin's natural selection, a purely physical mechanism of evolution he proposed in 1859, can be seen as part of that catching up with materialism and atheism. But a much more significant step was the sensation following publication of Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation 15 years earlier in 1844. I declare this a great book. It is a wrap-up of the science behind all phenomena, from the nebulae to solar systems, terrestrial geology, stages in the fossil record, evolution of living creatures, including us, to human psychology and prospects for our further evolution. With a steady, confident tread, it made science the standard to look to for accounting for all knowledge. It reads remarkably like a modern synopsis of scientific knowledge. It was published anonymously by what we would today call a professional journalist. As a member of the family operating the Chambers publishing empire, Robert was as likely to be reviewing novels as reporting on the latest science. In his day, science was still the preserve of gentlemen, reported in formal academic prose. By contrast, Chambers wrote Vestiges in a personal and reassuring style. And not being a gentleman, he published it anonymously. The book could not then be dismissed for its plebeian roots. It is a sober but good read. Herewith, three themes from the book: natural law, development, theory of evolution. Natural law. Robert Chambers was opposed as a deist. Deism was an Enlightenment form of religion. It drew from ancient Greek roots, from Plato's world spirit and Aristotle's first mover, to posit a God who sets the universe up, sets all its laws and so on in position, and then lets it run without interfering further. So that is deism, and Robert Chambers was, or as I say, posed as a deist. Of natural laws, he says, where have come all these beautiful regulations? Here science leaves us, but only to conclude from other grounds that there's a first cause to which all others are secondary and ministrative, a primitive almighty will of which these laws are merely the mandates. But they may be merely the mandates, but Chambers regards those laws as applying both invariably and universally. The regulations on which all the laws of matter operate are established on a rigidly accurate mathematical basis, so he's a good Newtonian. For example, the 54 or 55 chemical elements known in his day may be only modifications of a primordial form of matter, Analogy would lead us to conclude that the combinations of the primordial matter forming our so-called elements are as universal or are as liable to take place everywhere as are the laws of gravitation and centrifugal force. Given this universality of physical laws, how is change and development possible? Development is how natural law carries forward God's plan. The author sees development in the creation of stars and solar systems, in the succession of terrestrial geological strata, and in the succession of living creatures found in fossilized form in those strata. The inorganic has one final comprehensive law, gravitation. The organic, the other great department of mundane things, rests in like manner on one law, and that is development, or the development of natural law, by natural law. How can we read that, discover that law in the case of development of living creatures? By observation. As a Martian presented with earthlings of various ages would soon become convinced that men had once been boys, that boys had once been infants, and finally that all had been brought into the world in exactly the same circumstances, the stages in development are apparent in his detailed account of the appearance of fossils in successive geological strata. Chambers recorded many instances of extinctions and successions of types of creatures. Then he says that God created animated beings is a fact so powerfully evidenced and so universally received that I at once take it for granted. But in what way was the creation of animated beings affected? The ordinary notion may, I think, be not unjustly described as this, that the Almighty Author produced the progenitors of all existing species by some sort of personal or immediate exertion. But how does this notion comport with what we have seen of the gradual advance of species from the humblest to the highest? Some other idea must then be come to with regard to the mode in which the divine author proceeded in the organic creation. What is to hinder our supposing that the organic creation is also a result of natural laws, which are in like manner an expression of his will? Of special creation in defiance of universal laws, that is, God intervening specially, he says, surely this idea is too ridiculous to be for a moment entertained. Of Scripture, he says, I freely own that I do not think it right to adduce the Mosaic record, the Bible, either in objection to or support of any natural hypothesis. And this for many reasons, but particularly for this, that there is not the least appearance of any intention in that book to give philosophically exact views of nature. So he dismisses the Christian view of creation. Later, those who would object to the hypothesis of a creation by the intervention of law do not perhaps consider how powerful an argument in favor of the existence of God is lost by rejecting this doctrine. The theory of evolution Chambers comes up with, we know today, is wrong. But for me, his account is important for two reasons. First, the question of how life developed is one that has hitherto engaged no direct attention in almost any quarter. He lightly dismisses Lamarck's proposal. Chambers seems to himself to have committed to print the first detailed account of the stages through which life evolved. Second, his book caused a sensation and was extremely widely read. Vestiges sold as many copies in its first 8 years as Origin of Species did in its first 20. 10,000 copies of Vestiges as an inexpensive People's Edition. And Vestiges continued to outsell Origins throughout the 19th century. In Vestiges, therefore, we see how the issues raised by the fossil record were framed by someone reviewing the available literature from scratch prior to Darwin's formulation, by which our imaginations have since been bound. And we see the issues that prevailed when Origin appeared. In Origin, Darwin merely dotted the I's and crossed the T's and added credibility to Chambers' revelation. What got Darwin tarred and feathered was appearing to corroborate Chambers' account of humans having developed from monkeys. Darwin's proposal of natural selection as the primary mechanism of evolution seems to have made relatively little impact outside professional circles. For the Victorian public, Origin was a footnote to Vestiges. Chambers begins his account of the laws behind the development of life by reviewing his time's knowledge of forms of growth, invoking electrostatic electricity and biochemistry. He introduces the idea of adaptation, that environments can induce species into existence. Will it, to a geologist, appear irrational to suppose that, just as the pterodactyl was added in the era of the new red sandstone, when the earth had become suited to such a creature, so may these creatures, these other new creatures, have been added when media suitable for their existence arose? The whole train of animated beings, from the simplest and oldest up to the highest and most recent, are then to be regarded as a series of advances of the principle of development, which have depended upon external physical circumstances to which the resulting animals are appropriate. It has been one of the most agreeable tasks of modern science to trace the wonderfully exact adaptation of the organization of animals to the physical circumstances amidst which they are destined to live. After adaptation, he turns to homology. The limbs of all the vertebrate animals are in like manner on one plan, however various they may appear. These facts clearly show how all the various forms of our world are bound up in one, how the fundamental unity pervades and embraces them all in one system. So here he is stating, essentially in words, Darwin's tree of the evolution of additional species. For clues to that system, he turns to rudimentary organs. He traces organs across a set of animals that are useful in some but functionless in others. An example he gives is teeth in whale embryos. But these, not being wanted, are not developed, and the baleen is brought forward instead. The land animals, we may also be sure, have the rudiments of baleen in their organization. And here we see him embrace yet another familiar, if controversial, concept, pre-adaptation. He sees some examples of rudimentary organs as pre-adaptations, revealing an organ not due to become functional until the next creature in the set comes along, adapted to the next environment in the preordained developmental sequence. And finally, he brings in recapitulation, how later creatures recapitulate at the fetal stage the development shown in earlier kinds of creatures. Chambers has, in 1844, set out most of the terms of subsequent discourse: succession of types over geological periods, progress from simple to complex, extinctions, homologies, rudimentary organs, adaptation, and pre-adaptation. For his mechanism of development, Chambers has God embedding into the first creature all the specifications required for natural law to develop the rest of the living kingdoms as the appropriate geological conditions appear, leading, of course, to us and perhaps beyond us. 6 years before the publication of Vestiges, Darwin had found in natural selection a purely physical mechanism for generating those specifications, though only by a succession of tiny steps. Chambers supposes the same, the stages of advance being in all cases very small, namely for one species to another, so that the phenomenon has always been of a simple and modest character. And despite calling on God to start the process, Chambers came up with a purely physical mechanism for the origin of the earliest creature. We are drawn to the supposition that the first step in the creation of life upon this planet was a chemico-electrical operation by which simple germinal vesicles were produced. That's like a one-sentence description of what people are saying today. A weakness of Darwin's theory is that it accounts for only evolution. By contrast, Chambers has his natural laws apply equally to evolution and to individual development, pointing forward to modern Evo-Devo. The tendency of all these illustrations is to make us look at development, here meaning evolution, as the principle which has been immediately concerned in the peopling of the globe, a process extending over a vast space of time, but which is nevertheless connected in character with the briefer process by which an individual being is invoked from a simple germ. Chambers had already in Lamarck a natural mechanism, this is 35 years earlier, a natural mechanism to weigh against his divine plan plus laws. Here's how he glosses Lamarck's theory. Experience of once calling for the exercise of its faculties in a particular direction, by which exercise new development of organs took place, ending in variations sufficient to constitute a new species. Chambers rebuts this by remarking how marvelously creatures are adapted. Let us say, I say, only consider these things and we shall see that the decreeing of laws to bring about the whole was an act involving such a degree of wisdom and devise as we can only attribute adoringly to the one eternal and unchangeable. Chambers tackles human evolution head-on. No evasion here. The idea that any of the lower animals has been concerned in any way with the origin of man, is this not degrading? But were we acquainted for the first time with the circumstances attending to production of an individual of our race, he means sex, we might equally think them degrading and be eager to deny them and exclude them from the admitted truths of nature. Every individual among us actually passes through the characters of the insect, the fish, the reptile, before he is permitted to breathe the breath of life. If he, as appears, has chosen to employ inferior organisms as a generative medium for the production of higher ones, what right have we to find fault? These creatures are all of them part products of the Almighty conception, as well as ourselves. It has pleased Providence to arrange that one species should give birth to another, until the second highest gave birth to man, which is the very highest. So Chambers refers to us as a species, most closely related to monkeys, and he sees us giving rise in turn to other species. Are there yet to be species superior to us in organization, purer in feeling, more powerful in device and act? And who shall take a rule over us? There is in this nothing improbable on other grounds. There may then be occasion for a nobler type of humanity, which shall complete the zoological circle on this planet and realize some of the dreams of the purest spirits of the present race. Evolution of living creatures as physical bodies is as far as Darwin carried evolution in his Origin. But Chambers continues with his version of modern evolutionary psychology. He extends the reach of the science behind development to mind and morals. Accepting our immortal spirit, our ordinary mental manifestations may be looked upon as simple phenomena resulting from organizations, those of the lower animals, mind, being phenomena absolutely the same in character, though developed within much narrower limits. He quotes statistical analysis of human behaviors, for example, suicide rates in a country per year will stay pretty much the same. The statistical regularity in model affairs. He quotes statistical analysis of human behaviors to show that despite our sense of free will, we follow simple patterns. This statistical regularity in modern affairs, moral affairs, fully establishes their being under the presidency of law. Man is now seen to be an enigma only as an individual. In the mass, he is a mathematical problem. It is hardly necessary to say, much less to argue, that mental action, being proved to be under law, passes at once into the category of natural things. Its old metaphysical character, free will, vanishes in a moment, and the distinction usually taken between physical and moral is annulled as only an error in terms. This view agrees with what all observation teaches, that mental phenomena flow direct from the brain, obedient to law. Physical determinism of everything we think and do. And remember, this is in 1844. Queen Victoria is still in her mid-20s. We're nearing the end of the book. Chambers touches on neuroanatomy. The brain of the vertebrata is merely an expansion of one of the ganglia of the nervous cord of the molluscae and crustacea. There are many facts which tend to prove that the action of this apparatus is of an electric nature. So mental action may be an imponderable, intangible, and yet a real existence, and ruled by the eternal through his laws. Starting with a God, Chambers somehow ends up enmeshing us in physical determinism. For how brain determines mind and behavior, he refers us to phrenology. He feels the need to account for individual suffering. Living creatures are placed here to be sensible of enjoyments from the exercise of their faculties in relation to external things. The point of the cosmos is pleasure, conformable to our ideas of a creator in whom we are constantly discovering traits of a nature of which our own is but a faint and far-cast shadow at the best. This is an arrangement which, it is clear, only admits of the main and primary reasons for being good. The individual is left, as it were, to take his chance amidst the melee of the various laws affecting him. He ends with the causes of war, sex, disease, and slavery. But the consolation that all of this is in accord with natural law. Between them, Chambers and Darwin laid the basis for how we think today about how we evolved and what it means. I see them both as representatives of the British tradition of Newton's atomism being applied to human affairs. Chambers sees natural law as creating the best of all possible worlds, but only for people on average. For Darwin, the crucial natural law is natural selection. Only the fittest matter surviving to further the evolution of the species. Neither of them takes conscious experience into account, either as something to account for or as a factor in how evolution works. Now, why today do we see Darwin championed as the initiator and creative spirit behind evolution? I think this is because in the second half of the 19th century, physicalists rejected Chambers because of his invocation of an initial first mover, an almighty, starting the universe going with its physical laws. They instead preferred Darwin, who had none of that kind of speculation and simply proposed a purely physical mechanism of evolution. So they dismissed Chambers and we hear nothing of him. And in the 20th century, physicalists are very happy to march behind the flag of Darwinism because by accounting for the origin of the human nature and human spirit, he leaves nothing else to be accounted for. No reference to mind, no reference to consciousness. Evolution can be seen as purely physical. That's how the physicalists like it.